The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order by Samuel Phillips Huntington. Chapter 4: The Fading of the West: Power, Culture, and Indigenization. More broadly, the religious resurgence throughout the world is a reaction against secularism, moral relativism, and self indulgence, and a reaffirmation of the values of order, discipline, work, mutual help, and human solidarity. Religious groups meet social needs left untended by the state bureaucracies. These include the provision of medical and hospital services, kindergartens and schools, care for the elderly, prompt relief after natural and other catastrophes, and welfare and social support during periods of economic deprivation. The breakdown of order and of civil society creates vacuums which are filled by religious, often fundamentalist groups. If traditionally dominant religions do not meet the emotional and social needs of the uprooted, other religious groups move in to do so and in the process greatly expand their memberships and the saliency of religion in social and political life. South Korea historically was an overwhelmingly Buddhist country, with Christians numbering in 1950 perhaps 1% to 3% of the population. As South Korea took off into rapid economic development with massive urbanization and occupational differentiation, Buddhism was found wanting. For the millions who poured into the cities and for many who stayed behind in the altered countryside, the quiescent Buddhism of Korea's agrarian age lost its appeal. Christianity, with its message of personal salvation and individual destiny, offered a surer comfort in a time of confusion and change. By the 1980s, Christians, largely Presbyterians and Catholics, were at least 30% of South Korea's population. A similar and parallel shift occurred in Latin America. The number of Protestants in Latin America increased from roughly 7 million in 1960 to about 50 million in 1990. The reasons for this success, the Latin American Catholic bishops recognized in 1989, included the Catholic Church's slowness in coming to terms with the technicalities of urban life and its structure that occasionally makes it incapable of responding to the psychological needs of present day people. Unlike the Catholic Church, one Brazilian priest observed, the Protestant churches meet the basic needs of the person, human warmth, healing, a deep spiritual experience. The spread of Protestantism among the poor in Latin America is not primarily the replacement of one religion by another, but rather a major net increase in religious commitment and participation as nominal and passive Catholics become active and devout evangelicals. In Brazil, in the early 1990s, for instance, 20% of population identified themselves as Protestant and 73% as Catholic. Yet, on Sundays, 20 million people were in Protestant churches and about 12 million were in Catholic ones. Like the other world religions, Christianity is going through a resurgence connected to modernization, and in Latin America, it has taken a Protestant rather than a Catholic form. These changes in South Korea and Latin America reflect the inability of Buddhism and established Catholicism to meet the psychological, emotional, and social needs of the people caught in the traumas of modernization. Whether additional significant shifts in religious adherence occur elsewhere depends on the extent to which the prevailing religion is able to meet these needs. Given its emotional aridity. Confucianism appears particularly vulnerable. In Confucian countries, Protestantism and Catholicism could have an appeal similar to those of evangelical Protestantism to Latin Americans, Christianity to South Koreans, and fundamentalism to Muslims and Hindus. In China in the late 1980s, an economic growth was in full swing. Christianity also spread particularly among young people. Perhaps 50 million Chinese are Christian. The government has attempted to prevent their increase by jailing ministers, missionaries, and evangelists, prohibiting and suppressing religious ceremonies and activities, and in 1994, passing a law that prohibits foreigners from proselytizing or setting up religious schools or other religious organizations, and prohibits religious groups from engaging in independent or overseas finance activities. In Singapore, as in China, about 5% of the population is Christian. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, government ministers warned evangelists against upsetting the country's delicate religious balance, detained religious workers, including officials of Catholic organizations, and harassed in various ways Christian groups and individuals. With the end of the Cold War and the political openings that followed, Western churches also moved into the Orthodox former Soviet republics, competing with the revived Orthodox churches. Here too, as in China, an effort was made to curb their proselytizing. In 1993, at the urging of the Orthodox Church, the Russian parliament passed legislation requiring foreign religious groups to be accredited by the state or to be affiliated with a Russian religious organization if they were going to engage in missionary or educational work. President Yeltsin, however, refused to sign the bill into law. Overall, the record suggests that where they conflict, la revanche they due trumps indigenization. If the religious needs of modernization cannot be met by their traditional faiths, people turn to emotionally satisfying religious imports. In addition to the psychological, emotional, and social traumas of modernization, other stimulants to religious revival include the retreat of the West and the end of the Cold War. Beginning in the 19th century, the responses of non Western civilizations to the West generally moved through a progression of ideologies imported from the West. In the 19th century, non Western elites imbibed Western liberals' values, and their first expressions of opposition to the West took the form of liberal nationalism. In the 20th century, Russian, Asian, Arab, African, and Latin American elites imported socialist and Marxist ideologies and combined them with nationalism in opposition to Western capitalism and Western imperialism. The collapse of communism in the Soviet Union, its severe modification in China, and the failure of socialist economies to achieve sustained development have now created an ideological vacuum. Western governments, groups, and international institutions such as the IMF and World Bank have attempted to fill this vacuum with the doctrines of neo orthodox economies and democratic politics. The extent to which these doctrines will have a lasting impact in non Western cultures is uncertain. Meanwhile, however, people see communism as only the latest secular god to have failed, and in the absence of compelling new secular deities, they turn with relief and passion to the real thing. Religion takes over from ideology, and religious nationalism replaces secular nationalism. The movements for religious revival are anti secular anti universal, and except in their Christian manifestations, anti Western. They also are opposed to the relativism, egotism, and consumerism associated with what Bruce B. Lawrence has termed modernism, as distinct from modernity. By and large, they do not reject urbanization, industrialization, development, capitalism, science, and technology, and what these imply for the organization of society. In this sense, they are not anti modern. They accept modernization, as Lee Kuan Yew observes, and the inevitability of science and technology and the change in the lifestyles they bring. But they are unreceptive to the idea that they be westernized. Neither nationalism nor socialism, Al-Torabi argues, produced development in the Islamic world. Religion is the motor of development, and a purified Islam will play a role in the contemporary era comparable to that of the Protestant ethic in history of the West. Nor is religion incompatible with the development of a modern state. Islamic fundamentalist movements have been strong in the more advanced and seemingly more secular Muslim societies, such as Algeria, Iran, Egypt, Lebanon, and Tunisia. Religious movements, including particularly fundamentalist ones, are highly adept at using modern communications and organizational techniques to spread their message, illustrated most dramatically by the success of Protestant televangelism in Central America. Participants in the religious resurgence come from all walks of life, but overwhelmingly from two constituencies, both urban and both mobile. Recent migrants to the cities generally need emotional, social, and material support and guidance, which religious groups provide more than any other source. Religion for them, as Reggie Debray put it, is not the opium of the people but the vitamin of the weak. The other principal constituency is the new middle class embodying Doer's second generation indigenization phenomenon. The activists in Islamic fundamentalist groups are not, as Capel points out, aging conservatives or illiterate peasants. With Muslims, as with others, the religious revival is an urban phenomenon and appeals to the people who are modern oriented, well educated, and pursue careers in the professions, government, and commerce. Among Muslims, the young are religious, their parents secular. Much the same is the case with Hinduism, where the leaders of revivalist movements again come from the indigenized second generation and are often successful businessmen and administrators, labeled in the Indian press Scoopies, saffron clad yuppies. Their supporters in the early 1990s were increasingly from India's solid middle class Hindus, its merchants and accountants, its lawyers and engineers, and from its senior civil servants, intellectuals, and journalists. In South Korea, the same types of people increasingly filled Catholic and Presbyterian churches during the 1960s and 1970s. Religion, indigenous or imported, provides meaning and direction for the rising elites in modernizing societies. The attribution of value to a traditional religion, Ronald Doerr noted, is a claim to parity of respect asserted against dominant other nations and often simultaneously and more proximately against a local ruling class, which has embraced the values and lifestyles of those dominant other nations. More than anything else, William McNeill observes, reaffirmation of Islam, whatever its specific sectarian form means the repudiation of European and American influence upon local society, politics, and morals. In this sense, the revival of non Western religions is the most powerful manifestation of anti Westernism in non Western societies. That revival is not a rejection of modernity, it is a rejection of the West and of secular, relativistic, degenerate culture associated with the West. It is a rejection of what has been termed the Westoxification of non Western societies. It is a declaration of cultural independence from the West, a proud statement that we will be modern, but we won't be you. Chapter 5: Economics, Demography, and the Challenger Civilizations. Indigenization and the revival of religion are global phenomenon. They have been most evident, however, in the cultural assertiveness and challenges to the West that have come from Asia and from Islam. These have been the dynamic civilizations of the last quarter of the 20th century. The Islamic challenge is manifest in the pervasive cultural, social, and political resurgence of Islam in the Muslim world and the accompanying rejection of Western values and institutions. The Asian challenge is manifest in all East Asian civilizations, Sinic, Japanese, Buddhist, and Muslim, and emphasizes their cultural differences from the West and, at times, the commonalities they share, often identified with Confucianism. Both Asian and Muslims stress the superiority of their cultures to Western culture. In contrast, people in other non Western civilizations, Hindu, Orthodox, Latin American, African, may affirm the distinctive character of their cultures, but as of the mid 1990s, had been hesitant about proclaiming their superiority to Western culture. Asia and Islam stand alone and at times together in their increasingly confident assertiveness with respect to the West. Related but different causes lie behind these challenges. Asian assertiveness is rooted in economic growth. Muslim assertiveness stems in considerable measure from social mobilization and population growth. Each of these challenges is having and will continue to have into 21st century a highly destabilizing impact on global politics. The nature of those impacts, however, differs significantly. The economic development of China and other Asian societies provides their governments with both the incentives and the resources to become more demanding in their dealing with other countries. Population growth in Muslim countries, and particularly the expansion of the 15 to 24-year-old age cohort, provides recruits for fundamentalism, terrorism, insurgency, and migration. Economic growth strengthens Asian governments. Demographic growth threatens Muslim governments and non Muslim societies. The Asian affirmation. The economic development of East Asia has been one of the most significant developments in the world in the second half of the 20th century. This process began in Japan in the 1950s, and for a while, Japan was thought to be the great exception, a non Western country that had successfully modernized and become economically developed. The process of economic development, however, spread to the four tigers: Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and then to China, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and is taking hold in the Philippines, India, and Vietnam. These countries have often sustained for a decade or more average annual growth rates of 8 to 10% or more. An equally dramatic expansion of trade has occurred first between Asia and the world and then within Asia. This Asian economic performance contrasts dramatically with the modest growth of the European and American economies and the stagnation that has pervaded much of the rest of the world. The exception is thus no longer just Japan, it is increasingly all of Asia. The identity of wealth with the West and underdevelopment with the non West will not outlast the 20th century. The speed of this transformation has been overwhelming. As Kishore Mahbubani has pointed out, it took Britain and the United States 58 years and 47 years respectively to double their per capita output. But Japan did it in 33 years, Indonesia in 17, South Korea in 11, and China in 10. The Chinese economy grew at annual rates averaging 8% during the 1980s and the first half of 1990s, and the tigers were close behind. See figure 5.1. The Chinese economic area, the World Bank declared in 1993, had become the world's fourth growth pole, along with the United States, Japan, and Germany. According to most estimates, the Chinese economy will become the world's largest early in the 21st century. With the second and third largest economies in the world in the 1990s, Asia is likely to have 4 of the 5 largest and 7 of the 10 largest economies by 2020. By that date, Asian societies are likely to account for over 40% of global economic product. Most of the more competitive economies will probably be Asian, even if Asian economic growth levels off sooner and more precipitously than expected. The consequences of the growth that has already occurred for Asia and the world are still enormous. East Asian economic development is altering the balance of power between Asia and the West, specifically the United States. Successful economic development generates self confidence and assertiveness on part of those who produce it and benefit from it. Wealth, like power, is assumed to be proof of virtue, a demonstration of moral and cultural superiority. As they have become more successful economically, East Asians have not hesitated to emphasize the distinctiveness of their culture and to trumpet the superiority of their values and way of life compared to those of the West and other societies. Asian societies are decreasingly responsive to US demands and interests and increasingly able to resist pressure from the United States and other Western countries. A cultural renaissance, Ambassador Tommy Koh noted in 1993, is sweeping across Asia. It involves a growing self confidence, which means Asians no longer regard everything Western or American as necessarily the best. This renaissance manifests itself in increasing emphasis on both the distinctive cultural identities of individual Asian countries and the commonalities of Asian cultures, which distinguish them from Western culture. The significance of this cultural revival is written in the changing interaction of East Asia's two major societies with Western culture. When the West forced itself on China and Japan in the mid 19th century, after a momentary infatuation with Kemalism, the prevailing elites opted for a reformist strategy. With the Meiji Restoration, a dynamic group of reformers came to power in Japan, studied and borrowed Western techniques, practices, and institutions, and started the process of Japanese modernization. They did this in such a way, however, as to preserve the essentials of traditional Japanese culture, which in many respects contributed to modernization and which made it possible for Japan to invoke, reformulate, and build on the elements of that culture to arouse support for and justify its imperialism in the 1930s and 1940s. In China, on the other hand, the decaying Qing dynasty was unable to adapt successfully to the impact of the West. China was defeated, exploited, and humiliated by Japan and the European powers. The collapse of dynasty in 1910 was followed by division, civil war, and invocation of competing Western concepts by competing Chinese intellectual and political leaders. Sun Yat sen's three principles of nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood, Liang Qichao's liberalism, Mao Zedong's Marxist Leninism. At the end of the 1940s, the import from the Soviet Union won out over those from the West. Nationalism, liberalism, democracy, Christianity, and China was defined as a socialist society. In Japan, total defeat in the World War II produced total cultural discombobulation. It is very difficult now. One Westerner deeply involved in Japan commented in 1994 for us to appreciate the extent to which everything, religion, culture, every single aspect of this country's mental existence was drawn into the service of that war. The loss of the war was a complete shock to the system. In their minds, the whole thing became worthless and was thrown out. In its place, everything connected with the West, and particularly the victorious United States, came to be seen as good and desirable. Japan thus attempted to emulate the United States even as China emulated the Soviet Union. By the late 1970s, the failure of communism to produce economic development and the success of capitalism in Japan and increasingly in other Asian societies led new Chinese leadership to move away from the Soviet model. The collapse of the Soviet Union a decade later further underlined the failures of this import. The Chinese thus faced the issue of whether to turn westward or to turn inward. Many intellectuals and some others advocated wholesale westernization, a trend that reached its cultural and popular culminations in the television series River Elegy and the Goddess of Democracy, erected in Tiananmen Square. This Western orientation, however, commanded the support of neither the few hundred people who counted in Beijing nor the 800 million peasants who lived in the countryside. Total westernization was no more practical at the end of the 20th century than it had been at the end of the 19th century. The leadership instead chose a new version of Yong capitalism, an involvement in the world economy, on the one hand, combined with the political authoritarianism and recommitment to traditional Chinese culture on the other hand. In place of the revolutionary legitimacy of Marxist Leninism, the regime substituted performance legitimacy provided by surging economic development and nationalist legitimacy provided by invocation of the distinctive characteristic of Chinese culture. The post-Tiananmen regime, one commentator observed, has eagerly embraced Chinese nationalism as a new fount of legitimacy and has consciously aroused anti-Americanism to justify its power and its behavior. A Chinese cultural nationalism is thus emerging, epitomized in the words of one Hong Kong's leader in 1994. We, Chinese, feel nationalist, which we never felt before. We are Chinese and we feel proud in that. In China itself, in the early 1990s, there developed a popular desire to return to what is authentically Chinese, which often is patriarchal, nativistic, and authoritarian. Democracy in this historical re-emergence is discredited, as is Leninism, as just another foreign imposition. In the early 20th century, Chinese intellectuals, independently paralleling Weber, identified Confucianism as the source of Chinese backwardness. In the late 20th century, Chinese political leaders, paralleling Western social scientists, celebrate Confucianism as the source of Chinese progress. In the 1980s, the Chinese government began to promote interest in Confucianism, with party leaders declaring it the mainstream of Chinese culture. Confucianism also, of course, became an enthusiasm of Lee Kuan Yew, who saw it as a source of Singapore's success and became a missionary of Confucian values to the rest of the world. In the 1990s, the Taiwanese government declared itself to be the inheritor of Confucian thought. The president, Lee Teng-hui, identified the roots of Taiwan's democratization in its Chinese cultural heritage, stretching back to Kuo Yao, 21st century BC, Confucius, 5th century BC, and Mencius, 3rd century BC. Whether they wish to justify authoritarianism or democracy, Chinese leaders look for legitimation in their common Chinese culture, not in imported Western concepts. The nationalism promoted by the regime is Han nationalism, which helps to suppress the linguistic, regional, and economic differences among 90% of the Chinese population. At the same time, it also underlines the differences with the non-Chinese ethnic minorities that constitute less than 10% of China's population, but occupy 60% of its territory. It also provides a basis for the regime's opposition to Christianity, Christian organizations, and Christian proselytizing, which offer an alternative Western faith to fill the void left by the collapse of Maoist Leninism.